Ladies and gentlemen, I consider Nehemiah Gordon to be the foremost, first of all, the most honest scholar that I've met in my life. I believe that he is the most intelligent biblical scholar that I've met in more than 50 years, and he's a person that I can spend 5 hours with, and it is nonstop. And so he came to the United States, stayed with me, and during that time, we did 8 individual sessions, which we are calling the Karaite Files, in which Nehemiah and I will be together here at the Aviv Moon Studios and laying out things from the Scripture that I believe people have been waiting to hear for many, many years. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to welcome to the program Nehemiah Gordon. Nehemiah, great to have you here.
Hello, Michael. It's really great to be here.
Well, Nehemiah, tell us. You're the son of a rabbi that passed away recently, but your background was Orthodox. You grew up in Chicago. Tell us what happened, because your life started to change from that Orthodox upbringing very quickly, and to bring you where you are today.
So I was. And you mentioned that you were, of Jewish ancestry but raised Baptist. I was raised as an Orthodox Jew. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Messianic. I tell people that up front.
Introducing Nehemiah Gordon of Jerusalem, Israel, teaching on the Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus, presented during his January 2005 speaking tour in the United States. And now, Nehemiah Gordon.
It was a few years ago that Michael Rood came to me, and he asked me about a verse in the Gospel of Matthew that we're about to look at. And there Yeshua says, in Matthew, he says, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do." And what Yeshua seems to be saying here is that the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit in the seat of Moses. They have some type of Mosaic authority. Whatever they bid you observe, whatever they command you to do, that you must do if you're a disciple of Yeshua. And actually, I've dressed today as a modern-day Pharisee. I don't normally dress this way, but I've dressed in the garb of a modern-day Pharisee to illustrate to you what it would mean to obey the Pharisees. You would have to dress according to the traditional Pharisaical dress and follow Pharisaical practices. This is what it would mean to obey the Pharisees. And what really is the problem, though? What's the problem? What does it mean to obey the Pharisees? Well, I knew exactly what this meant because I was actually raised as a Pharisee, as a modern Orthodox Jew. Before I became a Karaite and Old Testament Jew, I was raised as a Pharisee. And one of the things I knew was that to obey the Pharisees would mean to follow rules and regulations that govern every aspect of life, literally from the moment you wake up in the morning until the moment you go to sleep at night. And here's an example of one of these rules and regulations, something that I was taught growing up. I was taught that from the Shulchan Aruch, which is a universally accepted guide to modern Pharisaical living, and there the Pharisees teach that when a person wakes up in the morning, first he must put on his right shoe, but not tie it. Then he must put on his left shoe and tie it, and go back and tie his right shoe. Now, do you really think that Yeshua was commanding you to obey the Pharisees, tell you to do these things? But that's what it said. That's what it says in Matthew 23. Whatsoever they bid you observe, whatsoever they command you to do, that observe and do. Do that. And it really seems that he's commanding his disciples to obey these rules and regulations that cover every aspect of life. By the way, it gets even better, because another rabbi came along and added some notes to this book, and he lived in a country where they didn't have shoelaces. And he explains, even with our shoes, which do not have laces, a person must still put on his right shoe first. Now, if you were going to obey whatever the Pharisees command you to do, you not only have to dress in this manner, but you have to put on the clothes according to specific rules and regulations. And is that really what Yeshua is commanding? Is that what he's commanding you as his disciples to do? Well, when I was having this discussion with Michael, I said, okay, Michael, I see this as very inconvenient for you as a disciple of Yeshua. It's not my problem, it's yours. But other than the great inconvenience of obeying the people that tell you which shoe to put on first in the morning, what makes you think that's not what Yeshua says? Or that's not what Yeshua meant? He clearly says that. And Michael pointed me to some verses in the very same passage in Matthew 23. For example, Matthew 23, verse 13, Yeshua says there, he's speaking to the Pharisees, he says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. You neither go in yourselves, neither suffer you that are entering to go in." Now here, 10 verses later, after saying the Pharisees have Mosaic authority, that they sit in the seat of Moses and you should obey them, he then says they shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. So what's going on here? Something doesn't fit. Something's not meshing here. Now that we understand Matthew 15, we really have a problem, don't we? Or actually, I don't have a problem, but you really have a problem. Because Matthew 15, Yeshua is very clearly warning his disciples not to follow the man-made laws and traditions of the Pharisees. But in Matthew 23, he says they have Mosaic authority. The Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses. Whatsoever they command you to do, that observe and do. So what's going on here? Matthew 15 very clearly is contradicting Matthew 23, the way it reads in the English. Well, when I first began to research this question, my first thing that I did is I looked in the Greek, and I saw that the Greek says the exact same thing as the English. Didn't really help me. And at this point, I was pretty much out of ideas. And I went to a colleague of mine at the Hebrew University where I was studying, and he was a big expert in New Testament studies, and I said, can you point me in some direction here? Give me some kind of indication of how I should proceed to try and solve this problem. And he began to explain to me that according to some scholars, the New Testament wasn't written in Greek. It was actually written in Hebrew. I thought that was very interesting, and I said, Hebrew? Why would you think the New Testament was written in Hebrew? And he explained to me that in certain parts of the New Testament, you have something which are called Hebraisms. Hebraisms are Hebrew thought patterns which are literally translated over into Greek, and when you read them in Greek, they sound like broken Greek. They sound like they were translated by a foreigner. It doesn't make sense. And let me illustrate to you what a Hebraism is by bringing you an Anglicism or an Anglicism. In English, we have an expression, dead as a doornail. Now imagine if I translated the phrase dead as a doornail into Chinese, and the Chinaman would come along and read, dead as a doornail? How dead is a doornail? What is that? It doesn't mean anything in Chinese, at least as far as I know from Chinese, but it certainly doesn't mean anything in Hebrew. And that's what a Hebraism is, these expressions and thought patterns that are translated over into Greek, and they make no sense in Greek. And what that means is you can read certain parts of the New Testament and see that they're clearly translated from another language, from Hebrew. Well, I began to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and Revelations in Greek, and I could see, yes, they're full of these Hebraisms. They sound like they were translated from Hebrew, and I wasn't really clear how this helped me, though, with Matthew 23. Okay, so let's say these books were written in Hebrew. Here's the standard grammar of New Testament Greek, Blasted de Brunner. This is the grammar used in every seminary in the world, the standard grammar of New Testament Greek. And there it says, many expressions which a Greek would not have used, such as dead as a doornail, many expressions which a Greek would not have used were bound to creep into a faithful written translation of a Semitic original. So it's universally recognized by scholars that certain parts of the New Testament were written in a Semitic language and then translated into Greek. And the debates that go on between scholars is which parts of the New Testament and how much, and what was that Semitic language? Was it Aramaic or was it Hebrew? That's something I'll touch upon a little bit at the end, the question of Aramaic. But it's universally recognized that certain parts of the New Testament were written in a foreign language and translated. And as I was studying this, I saw, okay, we have these Hebraisms, and I'm reading the New Testament in Greek, and I went back to my colleague at the university and I said, how did this help me? This is a very interesting homework assignment you gave me, but how did this help me? Ooh, how did that get in there? That's actually a picture of my dog, and I thought this would be a good place to insert some comic relief in the middle of this intensive linguistic discussion. But basically, that's the look I had on my face when I was I'm like, how does this help me? And she really has nothing to do with the story other than that she's extremely beautiful. And I'm looking at him and I'm saying, okay, Matthew 23, what does this have to do with it being written in Hebrew? It doesn't help me. I don't have the Hebrew. And he said, oh, Nehemiah, I forgot to tell you the most important part. What's the most important he forgot to tell me? This most important part, that the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew has actually survived down to modern times. And that's known today as Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew is named after a rabbi who lived in 14th century Spain named Shem Tov ibn Shaprut. And Shem Tov ibn Shaprut lived during the Spanish Inquisition at a time that was plagued by something called the Disputations. The Disputations were public debates that were forced upon the Jews by their Catholic oppressors, and the Jews were forced to defend their religion against the Catholic religion, and it was pretty much a no-win situation for the Jews. If the Jews lost these debates, they could be forcibly converted to Catholicism. If they won the debates, they would very often have to flee town, flee Spain, because they've now insulted the Catholic religion. Well, most Jews would agree that it's better to have to flee town than to be forcibly converted to Catholicism any day of the week and twice on Sunday. And Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut sat down and said, okay, I want to win these debates, so I don't have to be a Catholic. And he sat down and he wrote a book called Even Bochan, which translates into English as the test stone, in which he systematically goes through the arguments that the Jews could use in these debates. And interestingly enough, one of his main arguments was to systematically go through the words of Yeshua and show how the Catholics don't actually follow what Yeshua said. For example, he points out in his book that Yeshua upheld the Sabbath, and he says, how come you Catholics don't keep the Sabbath? Yeshua upheld the Sabbath. At the end of his book, Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut says, if we Jews really want to win these debates, what we need to do is start reading the New Testament. And at the end of his book, he includes an appendix, which was the Gospel of Matthew, of course, in Hebrew, because the whole book is in Hebrew. And because this was included as an appendix to the test stone, this became known as Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Now, Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew was known for centuries by Hebrew scholars. However, it was simply assumed that Shem Tov had translated his Matthew from Greek into Hebrew. That was just an assumption, and scholars never even bothered reading this book. They just assumed, because they assumed it was translated from Greek and that it wasn't really important. In the 1980s, a series of linguistic studies were carried out, and they found that Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew actually has certain characteristics which make it sound like this book wasn't translated from Greek, but actually that it was written in Hebrew. And one of the main characteristics that you find in Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew are what are known as Hebrew word puns. A Hebrew word pun is when you take two similar sounding Hebrew words, use them with different meanings in the same passage, and that creates a beautiful poetical style and a flow to the passage. And every ancient document written in Hebrew has these Hebrew word puns. The question is, though, what are they doing in a book that's supposedly translated from Greek? Well, first let's look at some examples of Hebrew word puns. The Tanakh, the Old Testament, is full of Hebrew word puns. Literally every page of the Tanakh has Hebrew word puns. For example, in chapter 2, it says, the first man was called Adam, and it says he was taken from the ground, Adamah. Adam, Adamah, man, ground. That's a classic Hebrew word pun. Two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. When you read it in Hebrew, it flows and it's beautiful, and it makes perfect sense. Another Hebrew word pun appears at the end of Genesis 2. It says, the man and his wife were naked. Naked in Hebrew is arumim. In the very next verse it says, the snake was clever. Clever in Hebrew is arum. Arumim, arum. Two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now in these last two examples, the Hebrew word pun really is just brought in to beautify the text, to make it flow and sound poetic. Sometimes, though, the Hebrew word pun is intricately interwoven into the actual message of Scripture. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 1, we read, and the word of Yehovah came to me, saying, what do you see, Jeremiah? And I said, I see an almond branch. And Yehovah said to me, you have seen well, for I am diligent to do my word. Now, when you read this in English, it makes absolutely no sense. What is the almond branch doing there? It's like a red herring. What is that almond branch doing in the prophecy? What does it have to do with diligence? Well, in Hebrew, it's immediately obvious, because almond is shaked, and diligent is shoked. Shaked, shoked, two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Well, of course, Genesis and Jeremiah have Hebrew word puns. They were written in Hebrew. But what they found is that Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew also has Hebrew word puns. For example, and we're just going to bring a few examples, but there are many, many examples. Matthew chapter 9, verse 8, and the crowd saw and they feared very much. Now, when you read this in English, you say, okay, what's the word pun? But in Hebrew, it's immediately obvious. And they saw as vayiru, and they feared as vayiru. Two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. This is a classic Hebrew word pun. But what is this doing in a book that was supposed to be translated from Greek? It shouldn't be there, should it? Here's another one. Hebrew Matthew 12, verse 13. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched out his hand. And it was after this that Yeshua knew, and he turned. Okay, again, in English, what's the word pun? You don't see anything. In Hebrew, it's immediately obvious. Vayet, and he stretched. Vayet, and he turned. It's two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. A classic Hebrew word pun. What is this doing in a book that was supposed to be translated from Greek, though? You would only have these Hebrew word puns if this was written in Hebrew. Here's another example, which is very interesting. Here in Hebrew Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 to 35, we have the parable of the debt. And this is the famous parable which talks about a king who's owed a debt by his servant, and that servant can't pay, so he goes down the food chain and oppresses his own servant. And 5 times in the parable it talks about paying. It says to pay 5 times. Pay, 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 pay. The Hebrew word for pay is shalem. So 5 times in the Hebrew it says shalem. Shalem, 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 shalem. Let's all learn that Hebrew word. What's the Hebrew word? Shalem. So 5 times it says to shalem, to pay. Then in the moral of the parable appears in verse 35, and there Yeshua says, so shall my Father in heaven do if you do not forgive each man his brother with a complete heart. And the Hebrew word for complete is shalem. Now, this is a classic Hebrew word pun that, just like in the example of Jeremiah, is intricately interwoven into the actual message of the parable. And without recognizing this Hebrew word pun, you're missing something. It's like that almond branch. You don't understand the connection there. In Hebrew, you immediately see the connection. He says it 5 times, and the 6th time it has a different meaning. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, it's very clear that this parable must have been spoken in Hebrew, because this Hebrew word pun is intricately interwoven into the actual parable. So if this was translated from Greek, that would be an impossible coincidence. And you have many Hebrew word puns like this in Shamtel's Hebrew Matthew. We only looked at a few examples. Here's a word pun that actually appears in Greek Matthew. Greek Matthew 16:18. Yeshua says to Shimon, to Peter, he says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And this is a Greek word pun that appears in the Greek Gospel of Matthew. And based on this verse, many scholars have argued that this is definitive proof that Matthew wrote the Gospel actually in Greek. Matthew didn't write in Hebrew. He must have written in Greek because there's a word pun in the actual Greek text. Now, we've already seen 3 word puns in the Hebrew, and that's just a very small sampling. There's only 1 word pun in the entire Greek text. Now, let's look at the Hebrew and see what it says there. In Hebrew, Matthew 16:18, it says, you are a stone, and I will build my house of prayer upon you. Now, if you read this in Hebrew, you immediately see there's a word pun in the Hebrew. Because stone is even, I will build is evneh. Even, evneh, stone, I will build. That's a classic Hebrew word pun, 2 similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, if this verse was a definitive proof that Matthew wrote the gospel in Greek, well, the very same verse has a word pun in Hebrew. So that proof falls away. Now, when I first learned of this, I thought, this is incredible. How could this be that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Hebrew? That's ridiculous. Okay, you bring me these linguistic arguments, but you can't just show up after 2,000 years and tell me the book was written in Hebrew. You have to have some kind of earlier evidence for this, earlier than Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut. And my first question was really, okay, the New Testament is preserved from the 3rd century and onwards in 5,000 manuscripts. And every one of those 5,000 manuscripts is in what language? It's in Greek. So how could Matthew have been written in Hebrew if there are 5,000 Greek manuscripts? And my next question was, okay, those manuscripts are maybe from a few hundred years after Matthew wrote the gospel. Maybe in the earlier period, there would be some type of testimony that would have to prove that it was written in Hebrew, maybe from one of the church fathers. And I said, okay, if Matthew was really written in Hebrew, how come none of the church fathers tell us that? And I actually investigated and found out that they do tell us that. They tell us that as a fact. Papias was one of the early church fathers who lived from 60 to 130 of the Common Era, and he's referred to as a disciple of a man named John the Presbyter, who you know as the author of the Gospel of John. And Papias, with his inside information, he says matter-of-factly, in the beginning of the 2nd century, less than 100 years after Yeshua's ministry, he says, Matthew collected the words in the Hebrew language. He states this as a fact, a universally known and recognized fact, that Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew language. And he goes on and he says, and each translated them as best he could. That's very interesting, that second half, because what he's reflecting here is a recognition that it was a very difficult thing to translate this gospel from Hebrew into other languages, and everybody did their best. They might not have always been very successful, but they did the best they could to translate these things into other languages from the Hebrew. Well, let's look at some of these manuscripts of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. This is a manuscript from St. Petersburg, the St. Petersburg manuscript. And Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew actually was published in 1987 based on the 9 manuscripts that were available at the time. This manuscript from St. Petersburg was at that time behind the Iron Curtain, and the Soviets wouldn't let anyone look at it. And it wasn't used when Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew was published. And because of that, the present publication, based on the 9 manuscripts, is really an incomplete picture of what's contained within this document, because it wasn't based on all of the manuscript evidence. And this is really a fascinating manuscript, because this is the first time this manuscript is being seen in the Western world. The first time this manuscript is being shown here. This is an unpublished manuscript, and who knows what's contained in these pages. Now, when I went to look at this manuscript in Jerusalem, actually this is in St. Petersburg in the former Soviet Union, in the city that was previously known as Leningrad. And with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, a delegation of Israeli scholars went over to St. Petersburg, and they began to microfilm all the Hebrew manuscripts they could get their hands on, literally to photograph every single page. And when I went to St. Petersburg, or when I went to look at the St. Petersburg manuscript in Jerusalem, I took it out, and when I brought it back to the librarian at Israel's National Library, he said to me a very interesting thing. He said, "Nehemiah, was there anything interesting in that manuscript?" And I thought that was a very strange question. I'd looked at many manuscripts. I've never had the librarian ask me if there's anything interesting there. That's just not his job. And I said, "Why are you asking me that question?" And he said, "Because no one has ever checked out that manuscript to look at it before. This has been sitting in Israel for the last more than 10 years, and no one had looked at this manuscript, no one had studied it, quite simply because there are thousands of these Hebrew manuscripts that have been uncovered from the former Soviet Union, and it will take generations and generations of Hebrew scholars to study all these manuscripts and decipher them, and no one's gotten around to this one. It's simply, you can imagine that Hebrew manuscripts of New Testament books are not very high on the agenda of some Israeli scholars. So who knows what's contained within the pages of this manuscript? No one knows. Well, I know, but really no one knows because no one studied it. And what revelations of truth are waiting to be revealed by studying this document? Here's another unpublished manuscript, which is the Breslov manuscript. This is also originated in a city in Eastern Europe in the former Soviet Union. However, today this manuscript is not in Breslau. It's actually in Prague. And there's a very interesting story behind this unpublished manuscript as well. In the 1940s, the Nazis ransacked Europe looking for Jewish artifacts, Judaica articles of artwork and manuscript and Torah scrolls, anything they could get their hands on. And they brought them all to Prague, and they set them up in a museum which the Nazis called the Museum of the Extinct Race, because the goals of the Nazis was to make the Jews extinct. And actually, to this very day, that's the largest collection of Judaica in the world, this former Museum of the Extinct Race. And who's extinct today and who isn't? That's a testimony, I think. We're still here. This is another manuscript. This manuscript actually is published. This is from the British Library. And the answer to our question of Matthew 23 can actually be found in this manuscript in the bottom 5 lines there, which is the section from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 3. And when we read that in the Hebrew, we'll get a completely new understanding. Everything that we're seeing now, these contradictions. Matthew 15, don't obey the Pharisees. Matthew 23, do obey the Pharisees. Right now we're struggling with this contradiction. When we read it in the Hebrew, everything will fall into place and we'll have a much clearer understanding. Everything will make sense. Now, I want to give you some advice, because I know this is a very long session, but this is stuff that you won't learn anywhere else, and this is really foundational stuff. What we're presenting here today is the tip of the iceberg. You don't even know the iceberg exists yet. We're just establishing the foundation to, really these are foundational things. And here's the book that I wrote on this. It's called The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And as you may have guessed, the reason I've called it that is that the way Yeshua's words are presented in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew is fundamentally different from the way they're portrayed in the Greek version. And that's why I call it The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And I highly recommend this book, because this is really foundational stuff. And there's a lot more that I'm not even going to be able to present here today. So really, I recommend you get this book and read it a few times. Give it to your friends and to your rabbis and your pastors, so they can also share on, especially your rabbis and pastors, so they can share on this very important topic, which really I lay some of the really foundations, which in future years you'll see that amazing things are going to be revealed from this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. Now let me, again, give you a piece of advice, because this is a very long study, and I've just completed the first half of the study. Michael's going to come up and say some very important words, so don't run away yet. But when Michael's done, we're going to have a short break, and then I'm going to come back and do the second half. Now, the second half is really we're getting deep into this Hebrew Matthew, and it's really, in a way, the most important part. So my advice is, if you can only come to one half of this study, come to the second half. So in Matthew chapter 23, we've seen that Yeshua says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They have this Mosaic authority. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. And here it really sounds like Yeshua is saying very clearly, you must obey the Pharisees. They sit in the seat of Moses. You must obey whatever they command you to do if you're going to be obedient to what Yeshua says. Well, we've already seen this doesn't really make sense. Matthew 15, Yeshua warns his disciples not to do according to the ways of the Pharisees. Their traditions of the elders transgress the Torah. However, in Matthew 23, saying obey whatever they tell you to do. If they tell you to put your right shoe on first in the morning, you better obey them because they have Mosaic authority. What's going on here? Well, the answer is here in the Hebrew. And if you can read this old Hebrew script, and you already know the answer. This is what it looks like transcribed into modern Hebrew print. And what Yeshua says there in Hebrew Matthew, chapter 23, verses 2 to 3, Yeshua says, Al kisei Moshe Yeshua pirushim v'chachamim, v'ata kol asher yomar lachem shimru v'asu, u'v'takanotehem u'ma'asehem al ta'asu, shehem omrim v'hem einam musim. So there you have it. There you see. It's very clear. This is what it would look like translated into English. There Yeshua says, the Pharisees and sages sit upon the seat of Moses, therefore all that he says to you, diligently do. But according to their reforms and their precedents, do not do, because they talk, but they do not do. Now that's a very subtle difference between what you saw in the Greek, a difference of one single word, or primarily one single word. In the Greek, it had said in Matthew, all that they say, you must obey all that they say, they being the Pharisees. In the Hebrew, he says you must obey all that he says, he being Moses. So the difference of this one single word fundamentally changes Yeshua's message. What he's saying now is, obey. If their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do as Moses says. Obey Moses. They claim their authority as they're sitting in this ornate stone chair in the synagogue, they're teaching with supposed authority, sitting in the seat of Moses, so obey Moses, do what Moses says. Now, how did this happen? How do we change from they say to he says? Well, this is what it looks like in Hebrew, in the Hebrew manuscripts. And you can see it's very similar. It's almost identical. The difference between he says and they say is the difference of one single letter, the Hebrew letter Vav. This one single letter, the addition of this one single letter changed Yeshua's original message, which was an instruction to his disciples to obey Moses, to an instruction to his disciples to obey the Pharisees. So it changed his message from something that made perfect sense, their claim to authorities that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do what Moses says, to this message which contradicts his own words in Matthew 15, which is obey the Pharisees. He goes on there, Yeshua, in Hebrew Matthew, and he says, according to their reforms and their precedents, do not do. And the word I've translated here as reforms in Hebrew is takanot. We've heard that word before, so let's all repeat that word. Takanot. So takanot are these man-made laws like the washing of the hands, and Yeshua's warning his disciples not to do according to their takanot. And I translated this before as enactments. A more precise dictionary definition of takanot is reforms that change biblical law. That's how the word is defined more precisely in the Jastrow Dictionary, which is a standard dictionary of early rabbinical Hebrew, late Second Temple Hebrew. Reforms that change biblical law. And the classic example of one of these man-made laws, these takanot, is the commandment to wash your hands of the rabbis before you eat bread. Well, now that we understand Matthew 23, and we see that Yeshua is not telling you to obey the Pharisees, he's telling you to obey Moses, we still have to go back at Matthew 15 and see what it says there in the Hebrew. If we started off with what was a contradiction in the Greek, we can't just look at the Hebrew of one passage and not the other. So now let's look at Matthew 15 in the Hebrew, and there we read, why do you also, Yeshua says to the Pharisees, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? You made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Can anyone guess what the Hebrew word behind tradition is? The word is takanot. So not only is there no contradiction in the Hebrew between Matthew 15 and Matthew 23, but in the Hebrew there's a consistent message throughout the entire book. There's this consistent string that runs through the book that Yeshua is warning his disciples not to follow the takanot of the Pharisees, these man-made laws of the Pharisees. If we go on in Matthew 15 in the Hebrew, we read in verse 9, remember how in the Greek it said teaching for doctrines the commandments of men? And I mentioned that was a paraphrase of Isaiah 29:13, which says learn commandments of men. Others translate this, learn commandments of men learned by rote. In the Hebrew Matthew, there's the exact quote from Isaiah word for word. Learn commandments of men. Now that's very interesting. If Hebrew Matthew is supposedly this translation from Greek, wouldn't it have the Hebrew equivalent of teaching for doctrines the commandments of men rather than the exact precise words of Isaiah? That's a very, very interesting. Yeshua goes on. He warns against the takanot of the Pharisees. He also warns against their precedents, not to do their precedents. And the Hebrew word for precedents is ma'asim. Ma'asim is a word we'll look at in a moment. But these are two really important words, takanot and ma'asim, because these are the two things that if you're disciples of Yeshua, that he's warning you not to do, the takanot and ma'asim. So let's all say those words together. Takanot and ma'asim. All right, so what are these ma'asim? Ma'asim are precedents. The literal meaning is actions or deeds, and in the Greek it translates this as ergon, which in your English you have works, the works of the Pharisees. But what are the works of the actions or deeds of the Pharisees? In Pharisee terminology, ma'asim refers to precedents or acts or deeds that serve as precedents. And what do they mean by that? Well, we've already seen that Pharisee law needs to legislate every aspect of life, literally from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to sleep at night. And what is, for example, the Pharisees command their disciples which shoe to put on first in the morning. So what does a Pharisee do when he comes to a new situation where the oral law doesn't tell him what to do? For example, if he lives in a country where you don't have shoelaces, and he doesn't know which shoe to put on first in the morning because he doesn't know which one to tie first because there are no laces. So what he does is he combs the oral law looking for instruction, and he combs tradition and man-made laws, and if he can't find any instruction on which shoe to put on first in the morning, if there are no laces, then he goes and he looks at the precedents of one of his rabbis. Meaning he looks and he says, we know that such and such a rabbi on such and such an occasion put on his right shoe first even though he didn't have laces, and that becomes a precedent. That then establishes what the proper norm, the proper standard of behavior is. The assumption is this rabbi could not be sinning, and if he put on his right shoe first, even though he didn't have laces, that's the proper standard for behavior. And what Yeshua is saying is, don't look to the precedents of the Pharisees as the proper standard of behavior. Don't do according to their precedents. Do as Moses says, not according to their takanot and their ma'asim. Let's look quickly at an example of a precedent. This is a precedent brought in the Talmud, and it says a ma'aseh. Ma'aseh is singular for ma'asim, so a precedent. A precedent which Rabban Gamliel, you probably thought it was pronounced Gamaliel. The correct Hebrew pronunciation is Gamliel. And Gamliel, as you all know, was the Pharisaical teacher of Shaul of Tarsus, of Paul. However, this is Gamliel's grandson, Gamliel II. So a precedent which Rabban Gamliel II and the elders were traveling in a ship when a Gentile made a ramp on which to descend, and Rabban Gamliel and the elders descended by it. Okay, so what on earth is this talking about? The Pharisees start off with the principle that if somebody builds something for you on the Sabbath, you may not use that. If they build a ramp for you on the Sabbath, you may not use that ramp. And so then they ask the question, what if the ramp is built on the Sabbath, but it's not specifically for me? May I use that ramp? And the oral law doesn't tell them what to do. So they go and they say, okay, we remember that one time Rabban Gamliel II descended on such a ramp, and that tells us that this was the proper behavior, and that such a thing is permissible. In other words, the behavior of the rabbi in a specific circumstance becomes the standard by which one should behave by in the future. And what Yeshua is warning his disciples is, don't do according to their takanot, and don't do according to their ma'asim. Their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do as he says. Do as Moses says. Now, what we've seen up until now is that the words of Yeshua in the Greek, what we may venture to call the Greek Jesus, because that's what he's called in Greek, Jesus, Jesus. The Greek Jesus, he's coming and he's changing Torah, adding to Torah, taking away. He's saying, oh, don't worry about not adding to the Torah. Do whatever the Pharisees tell you to do. If they tell you what shoe to put on first in the morning, put on that right shoe first. Even though that contradicts what he said 8 chapters earlier in Matthew 15. Now, we've seen now, on the other hand, the Hebrew Yeshua is actually telling people, do as Moses says. Their claim to authority is they sit in the seat of Moses, do as he says, do as Moses says. So the Hebrew Yeshua is actually, or Yeshua's words, as he's portrayed in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, is actually upholding Torah. Now, what about this statement, because they talk but they do not do? When I first read this, my question was, what do they talk and what don't they do? When we read this in the Greek, it's very clear that it's saying they're hypocrites. But now in the Hebrew, we have a whole new context. He's not saying to obey the Pharisees, even though they don't do what they do themselves, what they say themselves. He's saying obey Moses. So what's this they talk and they do not do? What are they talking and what aren't they doing? And when I first read this, I really wasn't sure what the answer was. I wasn't so clear. And the answer came to me in a very roundabout way. I'd received an email a number of years back from someone who is confusing Karaites and Samaritans. I mentioned to you that Karaites are strictly Old Testament Tanakh Jews. Samaritans, of course, you know from the New Testament, are the people in Samaria who worship at Mount Gerizim. Let's get a quick rundown of the difference. Karaites, of course, believe in the entire Tanakh, the Old Testament, whereas Samaritans believe only in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and their Torah is actually different than the Torah used by all the other Jews. In the Torah of the Samaritans, it commands them to worship on the high place on Mount Gerizim, which is a mountain just outside of Nablus, of Shechem, and whereas the Karaites worship at Jerusalem and turn to Jerusalem in prayer, like King Solomon talks about in 1 Kings 8. Of course, Karaites are Israelites or Jews, whereas Samaritans are Babylonians who were forcibly settled in the land of Israel by the Assyrian kings after the 10 northern tribes were exiled from Israel. And the story of the Samaritans is really given in 2 Kings chapter 17, where it talks about how the 10 tribes were exiled from Israel, and the king of Assyria didn't want this to be an empty land, so he brought in these people from Cuthia, from Babylon, and settled them into the land of Israel, into the northern part of Israel. And it talks about how when they first settled in the land, they were attacked by a plague of lions. And they said, why are we being attacked by lions? It must be because we're not worshiping the local God. So they went to the king of Assyria and said, can you please give us a priest that will teach us how to worship the local God, who of course in this case is the God of Israel. So who does the king of Assyria send them? He sends them one of the priests from the 10 northern tribes. This is one of the priests that had gotten the 10 northern tribes exiled in the first place. And what he teaches them is the ways of the 10 northern tribes that had gotten them exiled. And he brings with him the Torah, but he also at the same time teaches them to do according to the ways of these 10 tribes, worshiping at the high places, sacrificing outside of the temple in Jerusalem, on Mount Gerizim and other places. And then in 2 Kings 17, verse 34, it summarizes the ways of the Samaritans, and it says, until this very day they do according to their former ways, according to their statutes and their judgments. This is how it reads in the Hebrew. They do not fear Jehovah, and they do not do. And then in the Hebrew, the words they do not do is isolated in such a way that it emphasizes those words. And then it completes the sentence and says, according to the Torah and commandments that Jehovah commanded the children of Jacob. So what don't the Samaritans do? They don't do according to the Torah. Now, after I'd read Matthew 23 and then I reread this passage, I realized in Hebrew this sounds very similar. There's a similar style here. And it seemed to me that Yeshua was echoing the words of 2 Kings 17:34 about the Samaritans. And I think what he was saying is that just as the Samaritans of old do according to their statutes and their judgments, and they do not do according to the Torah, so too the Pharisees of his own era do according to their takanot and their ma'asim, their reforms and their precedents, and they talk Torah, but they don't do Torah. And what does he mean they talk Torah? They're sitting in the seat of Moses, talking Torah to you all day long, but what they're really telling you is not Torah. It's just in the guise of Torah. What they're really telling you are their own reforms and precedents, and they don't really do Torah. So again, what we've seen up till now is that in the Greek, we have this, Jesus is coming along and changing Torah, saying obey the Pharisees, whereas in the Hebrew, he's actually upholding Torah. Now, in light of that, how do we explain this passage, Matthew 5? Matthew 5, 6 times, Yeshua says, in the Greek, he says, you have heard it said, but I say. And it really sounds like when you read this in English, that Yeshua, or in the Greek, Jesus is coming along and changing entire Torah commandments, adding, taking away, modifying. So what's going on? Did he uphold Torah or did he not uphold Torah? And this is especially a very difficult textual question, because in that very same passage, in verse 17, he says he's not come to do away with one jot or one tittle. So how could he then turn around and a few verses later start changing things, saying, you have heard it said, but I say? Well, let's look at one passage here, one passage that particularly caught my eye. This is Matthew 5, 33 to 37. It says there in the Greek, again you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep the oath you have made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all. And here, very explicitly, Jesus is saying in the Greek not to swear at all. It's an absolute prohibition, if you're a disciple of Jesus, to swear, to make any kind of oath. And in fact, you can go to any court in the United States where there's the practice of putting your hand on a Bible and saying, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. And you could tell them, I'm a devout Christian, a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth, and because of that I can't swear, because Matthew 5:34 tells me I may not swear. And they won't think you're trying to pull a fast one, and they'll tell you, in fact, there's a standard formula for someone who's a devout Christian who's allowed to say, I affirm to tell the truth. And no one's going to think you're trying to pull a fast one or lie, because it's a standard thing that many devout Christians actually do. They won't swear because Jesus says do not swear at all. He goes on, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Who's the evil one? Okay, we'll use that as a working definition. You're defining him as Satan. We won't get into that whole question, though. So Satan, if you say anything beyond yes or no, then you are from Satan, according to the NIV translation of Matthew 5. And what that means is if you say, I swear by Jerusalem, yes, I will do such and such, you are from the evil one. And if you say, I swear by heaven, I will not do that, you are from the evil one. Well, I had a real problem when I saw this, because I said, okay, that doesn't really sound something wrong with this. And the reason I had a problem with this for me really began in Exodus 3:15. And many years ago, I was studying in Jerusalem under a Karaite sage named Mordechai Alfandari. And he was a very brilliant man. He would never try to convince you of anything. He would just present you the scriptural verses, and you would see that he was always right. And one day, he sat me down, and he said, Nehemiah, read to me Exodus 3:15 out loud. And I said, okay, I'll read it to you out loud. Now, bear in mind, being raised as a Pharisee, there were certain things that had been so ingrained and so I'd been taught, and I just couldn't break free from them for many years, even after I became a Karaite, because, these things have been ingrained so deeply. And you tell me, after I'm done reading this, what Pharisaical practice I'm expressing here. And back then, I'd read this verse to Mordechai, following my Pharisaical indoctrination. And God said further to Moses, thus shall you say to the children of Israel, Adonai, Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial from generation to generation. So what did I say anything wrong there? I said Adonai instead of what it actually says there. In fact, it says there in the Hebrew, Yud He Vav He, which I pronounce as Yehovah, others pronounce as Yahweh or Yahweh, and I won't go now into the reasons for those differences. But it's very clear that the letters in Hebrew are Yud He Vav He, Yehovah, or Yahweh, and I had read it following the rabbinical ban on the name as Adonai, which is Lord. And in fact, in all of your English Bibles, or most of your English Bibles, you'll have capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, which is following this rabbinical ban on the name. In fact, in the Hebrew text of Scripture, the name of the Creator, Yehovah, appears 6,828 times. Nearly 7,000 times. That's an average of approximately 7 times on each page of the Hebrew text of Scripture. And in every single instance, virtually, that you read in your English Bibles, you'll see it's translated as Lord, capital L-O-R-D, in small caps, which is simply the translation of Adonai. And this comes from a rabbinical ban on the name. In the Mishnah, it explains that anybody who reads that name according to its letters and not as Adonai has no portion in the world to come. So there's an absolute ban on pronouncing the name of the Creator that the Pharisees teach. In fact, most Pharisees today refer to the name of the Creator as the ineffable name of God. Ineffable means unpronounceable. You may not pronounce this name. I was taught with my mother's milk that the greatest sin that I could possibly do was to say the name of the Creator. That was utter blasphemy to say His name out loud. And I was taught to say Adonai. And even after I went to the Scriptures and became a Karaite, turning just to the Hebrew Scriptures, this was something that was so deeply ingrained that when I read this verse, I ended up reading it, Lord, this is my name forever, and this is my memorial from generation to generation. Even though right there in front of me were the Hebrew letters Yud He Vav He, Yehovah. Now, when I realized this, the words of the prophet came to mind, they have eyes, but they do not see. And I was talking about myself. The letters were right there in front of me, but being so indoctrinated and this being so deeply ingrained, this ban in the name, I'd read it as Lord. Now, what about the end of this verse, Exodus 3:15? It goes on, it says, this is my memorial from generation to generation. Yehovah is his memorial. What does that mean, memorial? Today only dead people have memorials. So what's his memorial? That's just a horrible translation. The word that they translate as memorial, the Hebrew word is zecher. Now, zecher in Hebrew does mean to remember, but it has a much broader meaning than it does in English. Zecher in Hebrew is to refer to something explicitly. To refer to something, you can refer to it with your mind, and that's to remember it. Or you can refer to it with your mouth, and that's to mention it. To explicitly summon it up in your memory or to summon it up with your mouth. Now, Exodus 23:13 is the same word, and there it says, "And the names of other gods you shall not zecher, nor shall they be heard upon your mouth." Now here it's very clear from the context that zecher does not mean to remember. It's not telling you don't remember Easter. It's telling you don't mention Easter, which I've just done now for educational purposes. But it's very clear from the context, it shall not be heard upon your mouth. You must not mention it. Don't even mention those names of the pagan gods. And when we're talking about the God of Israel, what it's saying is, this is my name forever. This is my zecher, my mention from generation to generation. What that means is, whenever we summon up his name, whether in our minds or in our mouths, whenever we refer to him, we must refer to him by his name, which is Yehovah, or others pronounce Yahweh. But it's very clear that his name is not Lord. That's just a title. Now, once I realized this, everything started to fall into place. Verses that I'd read 50 times, and I went over them before, and I never realized the significance of them. And that from these verses, it's very clear that the name of the Creator is not ineffable. For example, Deuteronomy 6:13 says, "You shall fear Yehovah your God, and you shall worship him, and in his name shall you swear." And others translate, "In his name shall you make oaths." Now, after I realized that the name of the Creator is not ineffable, I realized, okay, how can you swear in his name if you're not allowed to pronounce his name? It's very clear from this verse that the name is not ineffable. It's not forbidden to pronounce the name of the Creator. In fact, that's how we're supposed to mention him. We're supposed to refer to him. Again, a second time, it says, Deuteronomy 10:20, "Yehovah your God you shall fear, and him you shall worship, and to him shall you cling, and in his name shall you swear." Now, the practice of swearing in the name of the Creator, in the name of Yehovah, is something we see throughout the Tanakh. For example, in 1 Kings 2:23, we see that King Solomon makes a vow, and he says, "So shall Yehovah do to me, and even more." Now, what does he mean by that? "So shall Yehovah do to me, and even more"? First of all, by invoking the name of the Creator, he's swearing in the name, just like it says in Deuteronomy. "So shall Yehovah do to me, and even more." And what he means by that is he's laying a curse upon himself, saying that if I'm lying, may Yehovah do to me XYZ. It doesn't even tell us what the XYZ is. That's not the point of the story. "So shall Yehovah do to me, and even more than that, and even worse than that." Another vow formula we see throughout the Tanakh is what the vow that King David uses in 1 Samuel 20, verse 3. And there King David says, "As Yehovah lives." He's making a vow in the name of the Creator, Yehovah, saying, "As Yehovah lives." And what he means by this vow is, if I'm lying by my very actions, I'm denying the life of the Creator. That's a very serious vow. And the opposite is also true. If I'm telling the truth by my very actions, I'm declaring the life of the Creator. Now, this vow formula, "As Yehovah lives," is actually related to a very important end times prophecy, which appears in Jeremiah 12:16. And this verse was always fascinating to me, this whole passage, because if you read the passage, this is one of the few verses in the entire Tanakh, in the entire Old Testament, which is explicitly and exclusively speaking to the Gentiles. This is a verse that has absolutely nothing to do with me. This is a promise to the Gentiles for the end time. And there it says, "And it shall be, if they nevertheless learn the way of my people, to swear in my name as Yehovah lives," if the Gentiles will learn to swear as Yehovah lives, "in the way they taught my people to swear by Baal," meaning the Gentiles used to swear as Baal lives, and they came and they taught that practice to Israel. "If those same nations will learn to swear as Yehovah lives, then they shall be built into my people." That's a very important end-time prophecy for the nations, that they'll be built into Israel if they'll learn to swear as Yehovah lives. Now, you should be getting a little bit nervous here right now because Jesus has forbidden you to swear under any circumstances, and if you swear, you're from the evil one, according to the Greek Jesus. But let's see what it says in the Hebrew. In Hebrew, Matthew 5, we read, "You have further heard what was said by the ancients, you shall not swear falsely by my name." That's a direct quote, word for word, from Leviticus 19:12. "But you must pay your vow to Yehovah," which is a paraphrase of Deuteronomy 23:21. And then he goes on and he says, "But I say that you must not swear by anything falsely." Falsely is what he says in the Hebrew. So in the Hebrew, he's not prohibiting vows, he's prohibiting false vows. "Not by the earth, which is his footstool," meaning you must not say, "I swear by the earth," and be lying. You have to be telling the truth if you swear by the earth. "Nor by Jerusalem, which is his footstool, nor by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything added to this is evil." And we'll get back to anything added to this is evil in a minute. But in verse 37, he starts off saying, "Let your yes be yes, and your no, no." Now, he's not talking about making vows here. He's talking about making false vows, So when he says, let your yes be yes, what he means is, in this new context, is if you say, I swear by Jerusalem, yes, I will do such and such, that better be a true yes. That better not be a false yes. And if you say, no, I swear by the throne of God, I will do such and such, that better be a no. You better not be lying there. Now, why would he need to tell us that not to make false vows? Or why would he need to tell you not to make false vows? Isn't it obvious that you shouldn't make false vows? That's pretty obvious. But what happened apparently is in that period, some Pharisees came along and they said, okay, it says in Leviticus 19:12, you shall not swear falsely by my name. So if I don't use the name, I'm allowed to swear falsely. That's what the Pharisees were teaching in this period, that you're allowed to swear falsely as long as you don't use the name, because it says by my name. And anyway, they don't use the name, so they can swear falsely all day long. Now, what Yeshua is saying is, no, when it says in Scripture not to swear falsely by my name, it doesn't mean you can swear falsely by other things. Yes, as a keeper of Torah, you're supposed to be swearing by the name of the Creator. That's what we read in Deuteronomy. But if you're going to swear by other things, that doesn't mean you're allowed to lie. The principle behind this commandment is not to swear falsely. Even if you don't use the name, you're not supposed to swear falsely. And I think that's obvious to anybody who uses common sense and looks at this in its context. That this is not a permission to vow falsely or to swear falsely. Simply, the way that an Israelite should be swearing is by the name. And if you're swearing by the name, you must not swear falsely. And all Yeshua is doing here is he's bringing out the underlying Torah principle, saying, no, what you Pharisees are doing, opening up these loopholes, saying I'm allowed to swear falsely, that's not the point of the commandment. You're over-literalizing it. You're taking the words and disembodying them from the context and from the meaning behind what it's saying. You're only taking the words and not the spirit of what it's really saying, which is the contextual meaning that anyone with common sense would understand. Now, there's no doubt that 2,000 years ago when Yeshua said this, he would have been accused by the Pharisees of adding to the Torah. Because they said, it does say, by my name. And if you tell me I can't swear falsely by Jerusalem, where does it say that in Scripture? Now, to anyone who uses their common sense, to the simple Israelite shepherd or farmer who comes and hears, you shall not swear falsely by my name, it's obvious that you can't swear falsely by other things as well. That's obvious. But to the Pharisees, that's not so obvious because to them, Scripture is a divine code. And Yeshua wanted to make it very clear that he's not adding to Torah. He's just bringing out the underlying Torah principle. And that's why he ends his statement saying anything added to this is evil. He wouldn't add anything to the Torah because that would be evil. And this is simply a paraphrase of Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. Do not add anything to the Torah or take away. And Yeshua is simply reiterating this basic Torah principle. Now, what we have in the Greek, Matthew, like it or not, is an abolition of vows. Jesus is coming along and abolishing vows. You're forbidden to swear by anything. That's a fact. That's what he says there. In the Hebrew Matthew, on the other hand, we have an abolition of false vows. That's a very different message, isn't it? A very different statement. He's not abolishing vows, he's abolishing false vows. And really what we see is the Greek Jesus, as he's called in the Greek Jesus, is abolishing entire Torah commandments. Don't worry about adding to the Torah. Obey whatever the Pharisees tell you to do. And don't worry about making... Don't worry about vowing in the name of the Creator. Don't vow at all. That's what I'm telling you. Don't swear at all. Whereas we've now uncovered Hebrew Yeshua, the words of Yeshua as he's portrayed in the Hebrew, and there he's upholding Torah. He's saying they're claimed to authority as they sit in the seat of Moses. Do as Moses says. Do as he says. And they're telling you that you can jump through these loopholes and swear falsely. No, that's not the point of the commandment. The point of the commandment is not to swear falsely at all. Not to swear falsely. Now, you as believers need to make a real decision. You have to ask yourself a question. The Greek Jesus is changing the Torah, adding, taking away, abolishing, modifying. The Hebrew Yeshua is upholding the Torah. You need to make the decision and ask yourself the question, who are you going to believe? You can't just ignore the Greek and you can't just ignore the Hebrew. They're both there. You need to make the real conscious decision, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the Greek Jesus that's changing Torah or the Hebrew Yeshua who's upholding Torah? And by the way, I don't want anyone to walk away from here tonight and says, Nehemiah claims that there were two people who walked the earth and taught 2,000 years ago, one named Jesus, the other named Yeshua. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the way his words are portrayed in the Greek is fundamentally different than how the words are portrayed in the Hebrew. And you need to decide which one of those statements you believe, what's portrayed in the Greek or what's portrayed in the Hebrew. Let me help you out with that decision there. Let's look at Hebrew Matthew chapter 23, verses 16 and on. And there Yeshua is speaking to the Pharisees throughout Matthew 23. And there he says to the Pharisees, "Woe to you, you blind chairs." You can look in your Greek and you'll see it says, "Woe to you, you blind guides." In the Hebrew, he says, "You blind chairs." Remember in Matthew 23, verse 2, he said they sit in the seat of Moses. And now he's calling them the blind chairs. Yeah, you're sitting in that seat, but you're blind chairs. "Woe to you, you blind chairs, who say that he who swears by the sanctuary is not obligated." Does that sound familiar? Swear by the sanctuary is not obligated. In other words, if you say, "I swear by the temple in Jerusalem," you're allowed to lie because you haven't used the name. "Who say that he who swears by the sanctuary is not obligated, but he who vows by anything is sanctified to the sanctuary building is obligated to pay." Meaning if you make a vow to bring something to the temple, then you have to pay it. Well, that's very convenient, isn't it? "Madmen and blind men, which is greater the sanctuary or the thing which is sanctified to the sanctuary? And you say he who vows by the altar is not obligated. But he who vows to bring a sacrifice must give it." Meaning if you say, "I swear by the altar in Jerusalem," then you're allowed to lie because you haven't used the name. But if you swear to bring a sheep to the altar, then you have to give it because some of the priests were Pharisees, and the Pharisees have got to eat. So it's a simple economic consideration. "Which is greater, the sacrifice of the altar, the sanctuary, or the sacrifice?" And this next verse, verse 20, is really, I think, the decisive verse. There he says, "He who swears by the altar swears by it and by all that is in it." So here he's actually upholding vows. Now what happened to if you make a vow by anything, you're from the evil one? That's not here at all. That's not reflected at all. He's saying if you make a vow, you must keep that vow. You must not swear falsely. Now, the reason this is so significant is because in the Greek, in the very same verse in Greek Matthew, he says, "Therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it." In other words, in the Greek, he's saying the exact same thing as he's saying in the Hebrew on this particular verse, upholding vows. Meaning that in Matthew 23, 16 to 20, both in the Greek and the Hebrew, Yeshua is saying no to false vows, yes to true vows. Well, what happened to anybody who swears is from Satan? That's not being reflected here even in the Greek. So let's summarize what we have here. Against vows, we have Greek Matthew 5, and by the way, Greek James 5:12, which is a paraphrase of Greek Matthew 5. In favor of vows, we have the Torah. That's a pretty significant one. We have Jeremiah 12:16, Hebrew Matthew 5, Hebrew Matthew 23, and then even Greek Matthew 23. So what you can see is the Hebrew, or the Greek, the Hebrew is consistent with itself and it's consistent with the Torah. He's against false vows, in favor of true vows, whereas the Greek is not even consistent with itself. In Matthew 5, he's against vows altogether. In Matthew 23, he's upholding vows. So the Greek is not even internally consistent. And you need to make the decision, who are you going to believe? The Hebrew Yeshua, how Yeshua's words are portrayed in the Hebrew, or the Greek Jesus, the way he's portrayed in the Greek? Now, everything I talked about up till now is described in much greater detail in my book, The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And now you understand the title, that the way his words are portrayed in the Hebrew is different than how they're portrayed in the Greek. And now I want to talk about a few things which are not discussed in my book, but they're going to be discussed in my next book, which I'm writing right now. And the first thing I want to talk about are the manuscripts of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. And one of the things that we find is that Hebrew Matthew was published in 1987 along with an English translation. And when it was published along based on 9 manuscripts. And of those 9 manuscripts, you find that over time, the manuscripts go through a process called assimilation to the Greek. And what that means is that they start out very different from the Greek, and over time, a Hebrew scribe comes along and says, wait a minute, that's not what it's supposed to say in the Hebrew. That's not what it's supposed to say in Matthew. And why does he say that? Because he's read the Greek. And what he ends up doing is changing the Hebrew to match the Greek. So for example, in Hebrew Matthew 5:34, we saw the sentence that makes sense, that Yeshua's original words were, "I say to you that you must not swear by anything falsely." Well, some Hebrew scribes came along, and in some manuscripts, when they were copying them, they said, wait a minute, I know it doesn't say falsely in the Greek. And what they did is they deleted this word. And you end up with the Greek reading in the Hebrew, "I say to you that you must not swear by anything," which doesn't make sense. Now, the reason this is important is that of the 9 manuscripts that were published, 2 of these are very close to the Hebrew original words of Yeshua, meaning that when you compare them systematically with the Greek, you find many differences, and when the Greek doesn't make sense, the Hebrew does. Whereas the other manuscripts that were published have been highly assimilated to the Greek, meaning that in many places, not consistently, but in many places where the original Hebrew words make perfect sense and differ from the Greek, in these 7 other manuscripts, they've been adapted and modified, assimilated to match the Greek. And really, of these 9 manuscripts, these 2, the one in the British Library and the other one which is designated Manuscript C, are really the 2 most important manuscripts. And all these nuggets of truth and information that we're finding consistently appear in these manuscripts. And the other manuscripts, they appear haphazardly. Sometimes it's been modified, sometimes it hasn't. And what that means is out of the 9 manuscripts, 2 are really the most important. Why is that important? Because there's more than 9 manuscripts. From my preliminary research, I've been able to find that there are at least 23 manuscripts of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. And these are actually specific designations of manuscripts from around the world. For example, you can go to London to the Montefiore Library and ask to see manuscript number 286. And that's a manuscript of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. And these other 14 manuscripts have never been published. Now, if the first 9 manuscripts, if 2 out of those contain all these nuggets of truth and information, who knows what's in these other 14 manuscripts? No one knows. They haven't been studied. And until they're actually published, we won't know what information will come out of these manuscripts. The next thing I want to talk about is the question of the age of a manuscript versus the age of composition. That's a very important topic that we have to understand. This is a basic concept in textual studies, that the age that something was copied, the date that a manuscript was copied, very often differs from the date that it was originally written. For example, if you open up to the World Almanac and Book of Facts from 2005, that book was printed in 2005. However, if you turn to the Declaration of Independence, that was copied and printed in 2005, but it was originally written in what year? In 1776. So although the age of the manuscript, or in this case the printing, is 2005, the original date of composition is 1776. Why is it important? Because Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut copied Hebrew Matthew in 1380. That doesn't mean that he wrote Hebrew Matthew or composed Hebrew Matthew in 1380. Now, let's look at some other examples of this. Josephus Flavius is a famous Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century, and he wrote a history of the Jews called Antiquities of the Jews, and that was written in the 1st century. However, our earliest complete manuscript, or earliest manuscript of Antiquities of the Jews, is only from the 10th century, 900 years after he wrote his original book. Now, the original book written in the hand of Josephus, that's been gone for more than 1,000 years. And the reason for that is that manuscripts very often will not last more than a few hundred years, and if they're not copied, and copies made of those copies, and copies made of those copies, then the book won't survive. And in this case, the earliest manuscript of Antiquities of the Jews is from the 10th century, even though no one in the world denies that this book was written in the 1st century. Here's another interesting example. The earliest complete manuscript of Isaiah is from the 1st century before the Common Era, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, Isaiah wrote his book and prophesied 700 years earlier. The original book written by Isaiah, that's long gone. That's been gone for more than 2,000 years. Our earliest complete copy is from only 700 years after Isaiah wrote his book. And the significance of this is that although Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut copied Hebrew Matthew in 1380, the linguistic and textual evidence proved that it's much earlier than 1380. And in many cases more original than the Greek version. The last thing I want to talk about is the question of Hebrew versus Aramaic. This is something that's gotten a lot of attention recently. The Aramaic question. How many people here have seen the movie The Passion of the Christ? Okay, a good number of people. In the movie The Passion of the Christ, what language did Jesus of Nazareth speak? Right, he spoke Aramaic. Okay, so, well, I think we should stop the discussion here because it wouldn't be right for me to argue with such a great Hebrew scholar as Mel Gibson. But seriously, Mel Gibson went and he talked to, I'm sure, experts who told him that in the 1st century Yeshua spoke Aramaic. And why is it that he thought that, or why is it that his experts thought that? And here's one verse that has a lot of people very much confused. Acts 26:13-14. This is a famous vision that Shaul has, that Paul has on the road from Damascus. And there Paul describes his vision. He says, "About noon as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, 'Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me?' And Shaul describes that he says that he asked who's speaking, and he explains that the answer was that Yeshua is speaking. So according to and by the way, this is the NIV translation, which I'm sure you all know it stands for the nearly inspired version. Now, according to the NIV translation, what language did Yeshua speak to Shaul in? According to the NIV, Yeshua spoke to Shaul in Aramaic. Well, let's get to the bottom of this, because if you look at other translations, you probably already know that they don't have the word Aramaic. They have a different word. So why is it that the NIV translates, I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic? I mentioned earlier that based on internal linguistic evidence, it appears that Acts was originally written in Hebrew. However, we have not yet uncovered the Hebrew original of Acts. All we have is the Greek translation of Acts. So let's look at the Greek translation and see in the Greek translation what is the word that is translated into English by the NIV as Aramaic. The word in Greek that's translated as Aramaic is the Greek word Hebraidi. Hebraidi. Do we have any Greek scholars in the audience that can tell me the meaning of this? Any 3-year-olds that can tell me the meaning of this word Hebraidi? Hebraidi is Hebrew. That's obvious. You don't need to be a Greek scholar to know that Hebraidi is Hebrew. So Shaul didn't hear Yeshua speaking to him in Aramaic. He heard Yeshua speaking to him in Hebrew. So what language did Yeshua speak? Hebrew. Okay. So what we can see here is that there's been an intentional modification and change by some of the translation to cover up the fact that Yeshua spoke Hebrew. Now, here's another verse that has a lot of people confused. Psalm 22. And there we read the statement, my God, why have you forsaken me? And where is that familiar from? Of course, everyone knows that's Yeshua's dying words. Yeshua's dying words, my God, why have you forsaken me? And let's look at how these appear in the Greek. In Matthew 27, verse 46, we read, Yeshua cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, from the words that is to say, you already know that the Greek is translating something from a foreign language. And in fact, the words, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, those 4 words are not Greek words. Those are foreign words that are quoted in the Greek. And in fact, those words are Aramaic. So if we looked at this verse, it sounds like, if we looked at it in the Greek, it sounds like Yeshua must have spoken Aramaic. His dying words were in Aramaic. Let's look at the Hebrew, though. We've already seen the Greek doesn't always match the Hebrew. In Hebrew, Matthew 27:46, it says, Yeshua cried with a loud voice, saying in the holy language, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. Now, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, that's Hebrew. So in Hebrew, Matthew, his words are quoted in Hebrew. And not only are they quoted in Hebrew, but his words are specifically identified as being spoken in the holy language. Now, throughout history, Hebrew has been known primarily by 2 names, Ivrit, which is just the Hebrew word for Hebrew, and the holy tongue, Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language of the holy tongue. So, according to Hebrew Matthew, Yeshua spoke his final words in Hebrew, and not only that, but it's specifically identified as the language he's speaking in Hebrew, just like in Acts, it says Yeshua cried out speaking in Hebrew. Well, what's going on here? And really, we can't go into the final, we can't get to the bottom of this topic today. We're just going to present the tip of the iceberg. And really, when we look at this and we follow this to its logical conclusion, we get an entire new understanding of that final scene as Yeshua's dying, of what happened there. But we'll look at just the preliminary information. So, my God, why have you forsaken me? These words are quoted in the Greek text in Aramaic. The Greek text quotes these words in Aramaic. That's a fact. The second fact we have is that the Hebrew text quotes these words in Hebrew and specifically states that these words were spoken in Hebrew. So how could both these statements be true? Or can they both be true? Well, actually, they can both be true. Because if I look just at the Greek, I would determine that the Greek was translated from Aramaic. If I look at the Hebrew, I would determine that the Hebrew was spoken in Hebrew and written in Hebrew. How could both those be true? The only way they could both be true is if there's a missing Aramaic phase. And what happened, apparently, is the Hebrew was translated into Aramaic, and then from Aramaic it was translated into Greek. And actually, there's a lot of evidence to support this, that the Greek was translated from an Aramaic original, but it would seem from this evidence and lots of other evidence that I can't go into now, that the Aramaic was a translation from the Hebrew. Now, this is very significant, because what this means is that the Greek is not a second-hand translation from Hebrew, it's a third-hand translation from Hebrew. And remember that Papias told us that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew and many did their best to translate them. Well, apparently the Greek translator took one look at the Hebrew and said, no way, I'm going to go right to the Aramaic translation. And what we have is a translation of the translation in the Greek. Well, I talk more about a lot of these topics in my book, The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And I want to say some final closing words. I mentioned at the beginning that I don't look to Yeshua as the Messiah, and that really hasn't changed. I believe strictly in the Tanakh, the Old Testament. However, my understanding of who Yeshua was has changed. I started off doing this study believing, as most Jews do, that Yeshua came to usurp the Torah, to lead people astray, to change the Torah and modify the Torah, and lead people away from the Torah. And now I found that in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, the Hebrew Yeshua was actually leading people back to Torah, upholding the Torah, saying if their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, then do as Moses said. That he's not come to change one jot or one tittle, but he's simply upholding the Torah. Thank you.
Nehemiah Gordon's in-depth study into the Hebrew texts of Matthew is also available in his new book, The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. This is an essential companion to the live teaching as it contains fascinating information not presented in the video. To order The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus book or DVD, log on to www.hebrewyeshua.com or call 1-800-420-8206. For more information on Karaite Judaism, log on to Nehemiah Gordon's official Karaite website at www.karaites.com. That's Karaites.com.